I consulted with one of the women elders that I later interviewed for the book, and I asked her, what questions should I ask people? And she said, well, you should ask them, do you have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca? And this is in my Listening to Ayahuasca book, and it's in the research study of 2012. And 3/4 of the people, and I had an N of 81 people who had used ayahuasca at least once, 3/4 of them had an ongoing relationship. And that's the women's perspective. And it's in contrast to the big study that Hopkins did, and they did not ask the right question because they did not consult with a woman elder.
Psychedelics are now acknowledged as bringing a major paradigm shift to our understanding of mental health and of human consciousness. But without some guidance, much can go awry. What are the psychological, somatic, and spiritual frameworks that can support us working with psychedelics? And who are the people stepping up to help guide us in this process? Join us as we discuss all this and more in Season 2 of Adventures of the Psyche. Hello, friends. Welcome to Adventures of the Psyche. Today's episode, we are joined with Rachel Harris, an author who's worked as a psychologist for 40 years. She has had many personal psychedelic experiences throughout her life, starting in the late 60s in California and Esalen, blossoming with a more recent relationship with ayahuasca. And throughout this reemergence of psychedelics, she has been observing that the crucial voices of women are yet being omitted again. And she's decided to do something about it, writing a book called Swimming in the Sacred: Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground that we will discuss today. A little bit about Rachel. She is a PhD as an author and psychologist who's been in private practice for 40 years. She spent 10 years in an academic research department where she published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals and received a National Institute of Health New Investigators Award. She has written the books Listening to Ayahuasca and Swimming in the Sacred: Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground. Thank you, Rachel, for joining us. Congratulations on your book. I've really enjoyed reading it. Women have played such an essential role in psychedelic history, and yet few accounts reflect this. So many women have had to keep their psychedelic experiences quiet for so many reasons. Can you tell us what you have observed throughout your many years in the space and how that inspired you to write this book?
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, my primary concern about this book was that the women I interviewed would be happy with it. And that was my first and primary audience. So I interviewed about 15 women who have been working 20, 30, 40 years, pretty much most of their adult lives, working with these medicines underground. And how they came to that is they were working on themselves in the 60s and 70s, and they felt that they benefited so much from these medicines that there was no way they could not offer them to others and share the healing potential in these medicines. So that's how they began to move into the underground, as these medicines also at the same time became illegal. And most of these women, excuse me, most of these women went through real apprenticeships. They worked with some of the, and they worked with people from the 50s. They worked with the secret chief, Leo Zeff. They worked with Ralph Metzner and Stan Groff. They worked with many of the people from back then. And that's what's sort of being overlooked now, that their process of healing and working on themselves and then really training one-on-one, a real apprenticeship kind of training. So I call that at the, sitting at the elbow of someone. They worked closely with people. And that process took 6 or 7 years. That's not possible these days. We're training psychedelic therapists over the internet within a year, or a certain number of months. It's very hard for these therapists to get their own experience with the medicine, since they're still mostly illegal. And these women back then, yes, they were underground, but they had access to everything. And they worked with all the medicines at all the levels of dose. So they have broad expanse of experience. So they really know the territory. And that's what helps them when they're sitting with someone, is they can intuit and sort of feel into where that person is going. And they never, I mean, one of the rules they all follow is they never serve something they have not taken themselves.
I'm curious to learn how you first found yourself on this path. As a psychologist, you've been already studying the inner workings of the mind. Did you know about psychedelics first? And also, what did it take for you to start speaking about them publicly or writing about them publicly?
That was just a matter of aging. I got to the age where I'll say anything. Nothing stops me at this age. But I graduated from college in '68, so you can kind of place me in that generation. And I went right from college to Esalen Institute. And Esalen was, overflowing with psychedelics back then. And, it was California in the late '60s. So they were everywhere. And I had also been searching for that interface between, sort of a mystical interface between psychotherapy and Eastern religion. And that's how I ended up at Esalen. So then, experiencing the psychedelics there was just more fuel for my journey. And I was in a residential program, which means I was in a program that met in a small group for 6 months. And we worked with all the leaders back then. And then, I was still only 21 or 22 when that program was over. And I joined the staff at Esalen, and I worked on the massage crew for a couple of years. So we were all back then very somatically interested. This is kind of way before the professionals began to catch on to the importance of felt body experience, to be embodied. So that was kind of my background. Then after that, I had to find a graduate school where I could go and become a psychologist. And I was a little bit ahead of my time. There really weren't programs that were open to this, but I eventually made my way through a PhD and then entered into research, which suited me. And, I wrote one NIH research proposal proposing a study of basically Esalen massage for depressed veterans. And it was like in the 70s. This is in the 70s. And it didn't get funded, of course, but a study team came out to meet me and talk to me. They were very interested. There was no way they were going to give me a couple $100,000, but they were very interested. And that kind of interest generated finally, a few decades later, into NIH having a study of holistic practices of some sort. In the early '90s, they began to fund grants in those areas. So that was, I was in a very liberal research office at a medical school, but able to do that sort of crossover work. And that research career, as well as 35 years as a therapist, served me well when I sort of fell into ayahuasca's arms. I mean, that's really the best way to say it. I went to what I thought was a retreat center on the beach between the Pacific Ocean and the jungle. And I didn't really look at the talks that the faculty, the lectures that were going to be given. And the day before I left the States to go to Costa Rica, somebody called me and said, "Do you want to participate in the ayahuasca ceremonies?" And I said brilliantly, "What's that?" So that was in 2005. So I just sort of fell into it. And it was it was about the same time my daughter was finishing graduate school. So I was really through the householder time in my life and ready to pick up my old, basically hippie life and move forward with it with credentials and experience and training that I didn't have when I was in my early 20s. And that's really what led to the research study I did and the book, Listening to Ayahuasca. And then it was from out of that book that I met some of the elders, and they said, "We all have a vow of secrecy. We don't talk to anybody, but we'll talk to you."
That's a perfect segue to my next question, which is I decided, you write in your book, I decided early in the planning of this project to interview only women. I feel that the women doing this work have a different quality to their relationship with the medicines. Can you tell me about your observations and how the women's observation are different from a masculine observation?
Well, I'm hesitating because this is going to sound a little snarky, but as I said, I'm going to say it anyway. Is the women have ongoing, really lifelong relationships with the spirits of the medicine, whether it's grandmother ayahuasca or the spirit of ayahuasca, they have relationships with these medicines that come from a different realm. And this is not a Western cosmology. Doesn't fit into Western science. These are relationships with unseen others. And Johns Hopkins finally did a survey on the internet. So they had very high numbers. And the question was, did you encounter an entity? And then they wanted to know what drug you were using. So they had, number of people who used ayahuasca, some who used LSD. I mean, hundreds of people in each category. And they asked, did you encounter an entity? It's a yes or no question. Well, the women, even in my original ayahuasca study that was published in a journal in 2012, I consulted with one of the women elders that I later interviewed for the book, and I asked her, what question should I ask people? And she said, well, you should ask them, do you have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca? And this is in my Listening to Ayahuasca book, and it's in the research study of 2012. And 3/4 of the people, and I had an N of 81 people who had used ayahuasca at least once, 3/4 of them had an ongoing relationship. And that's the women's perspective. And it's in contrast to the big study that Hopkins did, and they did not ask the right question because they did not consult with a woman elder.
You mentioned earlier that these elders are having personal relationships with the plants and that these medicines accompany people throughout their lives. And I'm curious for you to describe. I think our audience is curious to hear, what does this personal relationship look like?
Well, based on the research, because I asked, do you have an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca? And then I asked, well, how do you communicate? And so people responded, she appears to them in dreams, in meditation. When they're in crisis, they can turn to her. So there are multiple ways, but there is this sense that this presence, this unseen guidance is available basically when requested. It's not just under the influence. And that's very important too. And no way do we have to explain that. But it's been I can say as a therapist, that for some people, that relationship has been very healing and affirming, and a relationship that gave them some foundation to begin to accept and love themselves. It repaired some of the early attachment trauma. I think we have yet to understand a lot of that. How that works, that these relationships with unseen others is very therapeutic. The other thing I'll say about these women is that they're very, certainly with all the experience they've had, they're very good at shifting states of consciousness. They move through dream space, medicine space, business space. They move through these different realms of consciousness very fluidly and elegantly. And I think this is not just something they've learned. When I asked them about their early childhood spiritual experiences, many of them already had openings to a spiritual presence in another world without any medicines involved from the time they were children.
Would you say dieta played a big role in is that at all a common theme with many of these?
No, it's not at all. It's for the few who were trained traditionally by shamans. For those people, and that's like just a couple, then a dieta is part of that traditional training. And yes, very important. But many of them did not train with indigenous shamans. And one person trained with South Southeast Asia shamans. So that's a whole different frame.
I'd love to learn more about the somatic sensing that you mentioned in your book, and how do the guides you interview use it in their work?
Well, this is how I talked about what they described. I don't know that they would, that's a psychological way of describing what they did. I don't think they would talk about it that way, but they talk about intuition. So you got to figure they're sitting there with someone who's under a blanket with earphones, eye shades. So there aren't many cues going on. Someone who's probably not talking to them very much. So how does the person sitting know where the person is journeying? And they have to do it by sort of sensing into that energy field and kind of going along with them, kind of joining them, somehow intuiting into them. And they talked about intuition as something they felt in their bones. It's a very somatic metaphor, that they felt it in their bones, that they knew where that person was, because they know the territory so well themselves, they could go with the person. You know, I talked about this in the ayahuasca book, and there's a book about shared death experience, and nurses who have worked on units where people die, they talk about sitting with a patient and going with them as they're dying. Now, nothing's being said. The person sort of appears to be in a coma. Maybe they're holding the hand, but they enter into that dying space with them. And these are nurses who are working, so they're not under the influence. But there's a somatic opening, blending, merging, so that they have an experience of traveling with that person who's dying. I experienced this in the house when I brought my father home to die, and he was dying in the next room. And I wrote about that in the ayahuasca book. But I think that's what these women are doing. There's this sensing into that energy field, so that they know the territory so well, they can join the person. So if a new psychedelic therapist has had one or two journeys, how do they know where the person is? They might not have experienced the same medicine. They're sitting for a medicine they don't know. It's a very different world these days. And so these women elders really represent a bygone era, is the best way I can put it. And I think we should be listening to them, even though they are still underground and they don't speak. I really try and convey some of what they've learned in this book.
And to follow up on the comments, follow up on what you were mentioning earlier around the death and dying and witnessing your father's death and experiencing that, is there anything else on that section, practice for death and dying, in the book that you'd like to share?
Well, yeah, I would refer people to Tony Bossis, Bossis. He's all over YouTube. He's part of the team at NYU where they're giving psilocybin to terminal cancer patients. And he loves to say this is about learning how to die before you die, which is, again, an ancient mystical path. And the medicines are very helpful to people who are dying. I mean, Aldous Huxley is sort of the archetype, where he received a shot of LSD as he was dying. And, from his wife, he asked for it, and Laura Huxley delivered it. And Laura Huxley talked about what's the hardest thing about being a guide, being a sitter, and she said, it's keeping your own stuff, your own personality, your own issues out of the way. And so that's the reason for the women having worked on themselves so deeply and for so long before they started working with the medicines with other people. They worked on their own healing. And I think, as we see these entheogens appear more and more in the modern world, that we already see some inflated egos. And the moral and spiritual question is, how do we manage these medicines in a way that's for the benefit of humanity?
Yep. Big questions indeed. Very, very essential questions here. I think doing the work is something that really needs to be broadcast a bit more. In order to be of service, we need to do our work first. I don't think we can jump to the other first.
But we are.
I know, and it's terrible. Thanks for getting this wisdom out that helps shift that. In the note of like being in service and delivering this important message, have you had to do any personal work yourself? Have you had any big transformational experiences with psychedelics, a psychedelic story perhaps you'd like to share?
Well, what I realized is I'm embarrassed to say it took me over a year to realize I'm interviewing women who follow a protocol I've never experienced. Because in the 60s, when I worked with medicines, I was out in nature, right? I wasn't with earphones and, an eye mask. So when that reality finally hit me, I did a journey right away. And I did an MDMA journey, which I hadn't done in decades. And I thought, well, after working for almost 20 years with ayahuasca, I thought, well, at last, a fun psychedelic. And this woman knew me well, and she thought she would have to give me a pretty high dose to knock my intellectual brain out of the way. And she overdosed me. And I had, I don't know, 6 or 7 hours of really being out there. And it was ayahuasca space. I took MDMA and I went to ayahuasca space. And it was valuable. And I had a good experience that really was preparation for my own death. But this is not the usual MDMA space. Eventually, after I crawled to the bathroom, which you don't usually do on MDMA, but of course you do on ayahuasca, crawled to the bathroom, gradually came back around. I thought, this was like an ayahuasca journey. Where was the fun? The ecstasy. Yes, that was my experience with probably really too high a dose.
Proceed with caution and pay attention to people's absorption rate. That makes a lot
I
of
know.
sense. Do you have any last words you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, the other thing I'll say about these women is they have elaborate protocols taking a medical history, and they have resources. They have doctors and nurse practitioners they work with. If they have any medical questions, they ask, they get double checked. And I mean, one intake protocol is like 16 pages long. So they are very, very careful about taking a medical history. And I think anybody who's working with the medicines outside of a university setting has to be very serious about their intake procedure and the resources they have that are available for people, that they do have relationships with doctors or healthcare professionals. They do have a plan for an emergency, and they have aftercare referrals, because these women are not therapists. They do not do integration therapy afterwards. They do integration debriefing sessions, but if someone wants therapy or more, they refer them to a therapist who knows the territory. So anybody working with these medicines needs to have a real support system for the people they're working with.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your work, for your book, and for joining us today.
Thank you so much.